Hello and welcome to this webinar on how to create a more effective volunteer funnel. My name is Sam Bennett. I am the sales lead for Rosterfy in the UK and Europe. If you've not heard of Rosterfy before, I will be explaining a little bit about who we are in just a second on the next slide. So what do I mean when I say volunteer application funnel? So a volunteer application funnel to us is essentially being able to engage with the right audiences that you're looking to engage with your program. So thinking about the different specific demographics, what makes a good volunteer? What demographics are we looking to engage with? And how do we pitch our messaging and our content and where we are placing that content in the right areas so that we're engaging more signups from the volunteer demographics that we want to see? It is then about how do we create a really nice volunteer process where we're getting a volunteer through that onboarding and screening stage as quickly and easily as possible with guided signups, lots of communications during the journey, and making it inclusive so that we're not having high dropout rates at certain points in that journey. In effect, we're looking to increase the conversion rate of volunteers. And what I mean by that is having more people convert through from application through to actually helping with your program. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to be sharing some customer stories throughout that you're able to download via QR codes and web content. So you'll be able to see a bit of a walk the walk and some real life examples of what we're talking about here. And we'll also conclude the session on understanding a lifetime value of a volunteer. So once we've engaged the right audiences and we've got them through our process with the right application journey and giving them a nice experience, what does that unlock for the charity? What difference and impact can that make to the wider organization and the different teams, particularly when you have volunteers that can help out in multi-facets, lots of different ways over the course of their life cycle being connected with your organization, which could be many years or even decades. So who are Rosterfy? So Rosterfy are world-leading specialists in volunteer management software. We've been in the market now for around about 8 or 9 years. I'm based in our London Bridge office, which heads up our European team. We also have offices across the globe as well, in the Middle East, Australia, and across the US. Last year, we had over 3 million active volunteers using Rosterfy worldwide, and we've recently passed 100 million volunteering hours through the platform. So we have lots and lots of experience when it comes to volunteer programs, and we know what good looks like when it comes to a volunteer application funnel. So in terms of the future of volunteer management, so for Rosterfy, as I said, we're one of the leading providers when it comes to being recognized by nonprofits, events, and volunteer programs all over the world. We store volunteer data really securely and meet compliance with local government initiatives in the different regions that you operate. We present opportunities to encourage recruitment, automating the onboarding process, making it slick and easy for the volunteer and getting more people through the funnel, building that community, supporting your cause in many different ways for decades to come. In terms of the marketplace at the moment, charities are all roughly struggling with this kind of overarching picture, and that is that demand for volunteers is up. Demand for charity services has increased across the board. Cuts to government spending, the cost of living crisis have all contributed towards a bigger demand for charity services in our communities. And at the same time, the number of people available to help has reduced. So the numbers of volunteers are falling globally. And again, they are linked to that cost of living crisis, people needing to go to work, people not having the flexibility they maybe once had during COVID. So it is a really tough market at the moment to keep volunteers engaged and keep them coming back to your program, as well as finding new volunteers and finding ways to keep them connected to your cause. Just to add some statistics to that, 24% fewer volunteers in the previous 3 years. That's a drop of nearly a quarter globally of volunteers that are contributing towards causes in a 3-year period, which is a really sharp drop. At the same time, 2 in 3 NFPs have seen an increase for demand in their services. So we've got that sort of double whammy of that increased demand and falling volunteer numbers. So I'd like to ask a question at the moment and just understand from on this survey of, do you understand at the moment how many volunteers are actually helping with your program? It can be quite tough to measure, especially if you don't have a system in place. So I'd really be interested to know, A, do you know the answer at all? And B, if you do know the answer, would you be willing to share that conversion rate? Because it'd be really interesting for us to hear. So when I'm talking about conversions, I really mean the number of people that go from applying to help with your organization and the ones that actually do end up helping and applying to a shift or coming and attending an event or contributing to a role in some way. So tracking basically the start and end date of your onboarding funnel and how many people make it through and how many people are dropping out and losing in that journey. We see a lot of parallels with the volunteer programs that we support and actually what we do on a day-to-day basis as well from a Rosterfy standpoint. So I'm not going to sit here and lecture you and tell you how to run a volunteer program, as whilst I have been a volunteer, I've not run volunteer programs myself. So it would be naive of me to do that. But I do see a lot of parallels between what we do on a day-to-day basis and the volunteer funnel. So I work in sales for Rosterfy. We have my colleague Martin, who's helped me put this webinar together, who heads up our marketing team. A big part of what we do is we have obviously revenue targets to work towards. We have new customers that we need to bring on board so that we can order to fund and fulfill and sustain and develop the product and service that we offer to our customers. So a big part of that challenge is to understand essentially what makes a good Rosterfy customer, why are they such a good fit for our program, and what are the benefits that they are getting for our program, and how do we then educate other potential customers that are in that same sort of demographic of how we could support them with their program, so that we're engaging more signups through our website and more inquiries coming through to us that want to inquire about our services. We then create a nice customer journey, which takes you from the first conversation that you have with us all the way through to being live with the Rosterfy customer. We work really hard on what does that journey look like? How do we give those organizations that come and talk to us the right tools, the right information, and the right knowledge to be able to understand exactly how we can support their program? We see the volunteer funnel in a very similar way. So it's about thinking about who are the demographics that you would like to engage with your program? Where are the areas that you want to target? What makes a good volunteer? And importantly, why do people volunteer with your program? What are the things that you can give back to that volunteer? It's thinking about how do we put that messaging together in different formats. It might be email campaigns. It might be when we're putting out role postings. So instead of just putting one role posting out there and a one-size-fits-all approach to volunteering, we're looking to approach different demographics with different sets of messaging based on the hurdles that those demographics might face and also the reasons that those demographics might get in touch. That way, we are increasing more engagement and we're getting more of the right types of volunteer that we want to engage with into our funnel. In the application process and have begun applying, we're then working on how do we make that journey as slick and quick as possible, making it really easy and nice and friendly for the volunteer to come through so that we are converting as many of them as possible. What you're able to do with a volunteer program is look at the initiatives that you have coming up in the current year, have an estimate of how many volunteers you think you're going to need to support those initiatives, and then work back based on the current conversion rates that you understand. So for example, if you figure out that your current conversion rates are 10% applicants through to active, you'd be able to work out and figure out that you need 10 times as many applicants as you'll need active volunteers, or indeed being able to increase those conversion rates so that you're not having to rely on finding 10x every time that you're looking to run a new program. It's about understanding the funnel and really understanding what are the stages that a volunteer would go through when they sign up with your program, and particularly understanding, are there any areas where they're facing challenges or high levels of dropout? Particularly important when we're making our programs inclusive. So if there are people that have impairments or reasons or hurdles where they might struggle with some of your process, how do we make that process as inclusive as possible and make sure we're guiding people through that journey and making it accessible? As I was saying, we're talking about really tailoring messaging to different demographics. So a big part of that exercise is understanding the right demographics that you want to come and help out with your volunteer program. And how do we appeal to them? So a big part of that exercise would be understanding why a volunteer in each demographic would help and would want to help, and the benefit that they would get from volunteering with your program. So we obviously had, as I said, 3 million volunteers using Rosterfy actively last year. We have a large number of volunteers who also registered directly with Rosterfy because they're intrigued about volunteering and want to come and help. So they often register with Rosterfy to understand the different programs that we support and find opportunities near them to help. As part of that exercise, we do some routine surveys. So we do some pulse check surveys, understand a bit about their experience as an end user, but also understand their motivations for wanting to volunteer. We've seen some really interesting findings in that, in the sense that the different, particularly age demographics, have different reasons for wanting to volunteer. So for example, the most important reason for volunteering for an over 60 is that they wanted to be part of a community. They want to give back to their local area. They want to be able to make friends and connections in their local community and build a social life around their volunteering efforts as well. Whereas if you look at Gen Z, when we asked the Gen Z volunteers that are in our demographic and our database, we figured out that the most important thing to them was actually that they wanted to improve their job prospects. So if you think Gen Z, they're coming into a very competitive jobs market. They've had years where maybe they've had education that's been virtual, which might have stunted some of their growth when it comes to building connections in the industry and building up some of their face-to-face experience. So they're very much looking at volunteering as a way to help them engage with that. So you've got to think about when you are positioning your roles and your role postings, if you are looking to engage with Gen Z volunteers as an example, think about the fact that maybe career development is one of the things that they're most interested in. Think about where we can post that application. So, can we put it into local colleges, local universities, and also thinking about the messaging behind why they should be engaging with your program. Is there anything that you could give back? So we have seen examples in the past where volunteers have been able to go through onto paid employment from their volunteering experience with the organization. If that is possible, that's great. If you've seen volunteers do that in the past, tell those stories, because that might be a great pathway to get more signups. Appreciate that is not always possible though. So other things that you can think about would be, how do you help the volunteer themselves to be able to demonstrate the impact that they've had with volunteering? So thinking about giving them communications, giving them rewards, certificates, reference letters that they can take on to UCAS applications, Duke of Edinburgh schemes, onto job applications and CVs as well. So being able to give them references and help maybe building their CV and writing those CVs and telling that experience. And that could be part of a reason that they might want to engage with your charity and something that you could give back to those volunteers. On a similar sort of theme, those Gen Z sort of volunteers, they could be using this, as I said, to build up some of their experience levels. So what we could also do is allow them to have exposure to some senior contacts. So maybe within your charity, you can give them maybe a seat as a trustee on a board for a day, or maybe you can just connect them with some senior people within the organization where they can learn some skill sets, they can learn different ways of working, different roles that might be available, and understand career paths and learn skill sets of how to present themselves when it comes to interviews. Having exposure to those senior contacts in a charity could be another great thing that you could give back to your volunteers. So time for another question. Be really interested to hear at the moment, do you actually, at the moment, when posting volunteer roles, are you targeting those roles towards a particular demographic? Or is it currently a more generic posting that's put out to your demographic? There isn't a right or wrong answer, but it's just hopefully making you think about some of these things and thinking about where in future you might be able to post some of these opportunities. Just to quickly summarize on Gen Z then, so career prospects is the most important thing. They also very much care about societal change, climate change, equality, and building community as well. So those are all areas that we know Gen Z want to help. They want to make their communities better places. They want to engage with people and help protect their future. So things like climate change, making their environment a nicer place, and building themselves up for success for long term in their community. So think about that when you are posting those roles and things that you can give back. So that moves on to the second stage of our webinar. So thinking about the demographics and how do we target them, how do we engage the right people and get more people through to actually apply to our website. The next part of the challenge is that we then need to get them through to actually actively helping. It's very easy to put your hand up and say, yeah, I'd like to help, but quite a lot of the time people can get distracted, other priorities can come up, and people can drop out in that funnel. That makes speed really important. So when it comes to onboarding volunteers, we've got to make it a really nice experience where they feel well supported, they feel connected to your organization, and they have clear communications about where they're at in the journey at the moment and what else they need to complete when signing up. So it's all about how do we shorten the time between A to B? How do we speed up some of these steps? If there's a background check that needs to be done, how do we get that done and sent out as quickly as possible? With reference forms, is there a way that we can maybe automate those references so that they're going straight out to the referee with reminders going out straight away, so that whilst a volunteer is completing their waiver forms, completing some of their training, the background checks and the references are taking care of themselves, and therefore we are shrinking that time down when it comes to actually onboarding those volunteers. A bit of self-service always helps as well. So for volunteers, particularly with young volunteers, they like to be able to log into a portal. They like to see where they're at currently in that process, and they like to be able to self-serve. So when it's scheduling things like interviews or training sessions, briefing sessions, maybe it's nice to have a few different slots available and allow the volunteers to self-book themselves into those positions. It's a really flexible approach that allows the volunteer to pick when suits them. The next part of this process, we've spoken about speed. So there's a few customer stories I'll speak about towards the end of this webinar. But with organizations that we support, a lot of them will have some very necessary screening steps that need to be done. So we need to capture details about the volunteer. We might need them to complete forms. There might be interviews. There might be references, background checks, training, screening steps that need to be done. They're absolutely vital, particularly if you have volunteers supporting vulnerable people or young people. It is really important that these steps are done. So with a platform like Rosterfy, what we can help to do is automate some of these processes, speed up the time it takes to get from a volunteer application through the funnel. There is actually a case study that's on screen at the moment that you'll be able to download and look at from British Heart Foundation. So they were able to shrink their time to onboard a new volunteer from 42 days down to 21. And I think that number's falling all of the time because they're looking for gradual improvements. And what they've done really well is they've understood what those sign-up steps are and where are most volunteers getting stuck. What stage in that onboarding process are volunteers spending the most amount of time, and what stage in that onboarding process are we losing the most amount of volunteers, and how do we slicken that process up? So they've worked really hard at that, and they've been able to, as I say, more than half the amount of time that it takes to onboard a new volunteer. That in turn has increased their conversion rates by around about 4 times. So if you think about that as a volunteer program, if you're able to increase the number of volunteers, active volunteers that you have by 4 times from the same number of volunteer applicants, just think about what that might do for your program. If you're feeling that you're short of volunteers at the moment, it might literally just be that a nicer experience, a quicker, snappier sign-up experience would give you enough volunteers that you need without having to go and find more people. Actually, the same number of applicants might suffice. You might be sitting there saying, well, actually, we have plenty of volunteers. We don't need swamps of volunteers, but there are always ways that a volunteer can help. And that's part of what I'll touch on towards the end of this presentation when we're talking about lifetime value. I spoke a bit earlier about Rosterfy, so we do the exact same thing. So we very much will have people inquire through our website when it comes to wanting to look at volunteer management software and come to talk to us. We would typically go through a 6-stage process of understanding your goals, demonstrating the Rosterfy platform, establishing those goals, putting together a nice business case and proposal for you that then gets signed and handed over to the onboarding team. So we're always looking at ways of being dynamic and finding ways to speed up that onboarding kind of process for a new inquiry, get people through that funnel more quickly and give them the information that they need to see self-serve as much as possible so that we are being transparent and we're helping volunteer applicants and inquiries actually just to understand what, how we can better support their program from the get-go. Another point that I touched on there with British Heart Foundation is around the automation. So in Rosterfy, we can automate things like reference checks. So if you have referees that need to be completed, let's say a volunteer needs 2 references, what would typically happen is a volunteer would submit through their referee details into the platform. That would then automatically send a customized reference form to those references and remind the references to complete those applicants. And that could start from the very beginning when a volunteer first comes through the funnel. So immediately those reference forms could be going out and the reminders being sent, meaning that we can get those references back ready for the team to review and pass the volunteer on to the next stage. So that's very important. Similarly with background checks, when it comes to DBS checks and those sorts of things, we integrate with background check providers. So a DBS check, for example, could be sent directly from Rosterfy to the background check provider and sync back to say whether or not the volunteer is cleared. So again, making it quicker, taking away that manual admin of checking those background checks manually and speeding up that process for the volunteer. Because no one likes doing these. They can be quite intrusive, but if we make them quick and easy for the volunteer, it just makes it so much nicer. As I touched on earlier, having self-serve interviews, self-serve briefing sessions that volunteers can book slots online that suit them, and also onboarding training as well. You can have onboarding training assigned to volunteers within the platform where they can consume content, they can answer questions around those, and you can set an expiry date on the training as well that reminds the volunteers when they need to do this. So one of the key things that I will always say, and I advocate for, and you can see an example on screen at the moment of a volunteer portal, is showing the volunteer the journey that they need to go on. So they've signed up for a role, maybe they've signed up for multiple roles with your organization. It's very important that the volunteer understands where they are currently in the application funnel, what it is that they need to do right now, but also what is coming up. what are the future steps that they have to go through. By setting those expectations at the start and allowing the volunteer to track their own progress through the system, we are increasing the touch points, we're increasing the understanding of those onboarding steps, we're allowing the volunteer to feel connected to the cause as they're working through this journey, and we're reducing the dropout. There's nothing more frustrating than having 6 or 7 steps to do, and just every step is just an extra ask, an extra ask, an extra ask. And a volunteer could be wondering how many steps are there to this process. That's when they're likely to get frustrated and leave the process halfway through. Another really great case study. This is an organisation that's very close to my heart. There's an organisation called Literacy Pirates based in Hackney in London. They support children all across London and parts of the UK now with developing their literacy skills. So they have volunteers who mostly are teachers or their parents wanting to give back, helping their young children that come to the programme with their reading and writing. Obviously, when you're supporting children, be it face-to-face or online, they have one-to-one coaching, they have volunteers who are supporting small groups of children, and they have quite a lengthy sign-up process because of that. So there's around about 8 onboarding steps that they would need to do. You'd have forms that need to be completed, DBS checks, reference checks need to be done, training has to be completed and booked. You have to understand the platform that they use to deliver the training. So there's lots of different hurdles and things in the way between someone expressing their interest and actually being able to help. They are a very data-driven organization. They were, for the very first time that I met them, they were using a fundraising system to track the different stages that a volunteer goes through when they sign up. They've now moved all of that onto Rosterfy, and the reason they've done it is because it gives the volunteer that self-service view. The volunteer can understand their journey, they can see where they're at in that journey, and some of those self-service aspects that I just explained were really important to them. Rosterfy also helps with self-service automation, so they are not having to, as a volunteer management team, chase up reminders, make sure that references have been done, chase up manually the background check forms. Those are all going through automatically. So what we've been able to achieve with them so far is that they've been able to increase their conversion rates of volunteers up over 30%, and they're striving for 40% next year. They have a really, really good handle on the steps that are involved, and they have a really good understanding of where in their process volunteers are currently dropping out. So one of the things that they found was that they were asking for DBS checks, background checks, to be done at the very start of the process. DBS checks can be quite lengthy forms. They can be quite intrusive in terms of information that needs to be shared. And they found that actually by asking for that up front, they were facing high levels of dropout at the very beginning of the process. So what they've now done is they've reordered their process. They still need the background checks to be done, of course, that's very important, but they've now moved that towards the tail end of their volunteer application process now. What that's meant is that the volunteers can then have a bit more of an understanding about the organization. They can attend briefing sessions, they can see training content, they can start to learn more about what the organization are doing and become connected to the cause, so that by the time they are asked to do a background check, they're already bought into the program and maybe have even attended a couple of sessions to understand what the program's all about. They have found that that has drastically increased their conversion rates, and that all comes from just understanding your data and being able to find improvements within that cycle. So we've spoken about how do we engage more people from the get-go? How do we find the right demographics and get them through and engage with our program, and why do they want to come and help? How do we then create an experience that's quick and slick and converts more people through the funnel? So we have customers that have converted 3 to 5 times more volunteers than they were previously. So what is the impact of having that number of volunteers come and help? And that's when understanding the lifetime value of a volunteer really comes in. So when I talk about lifetime value, I'm really talking about, as the phrase sounds, I'm talking about what is the lifetime value, what is the overall contribution that that person, not that volunteer necessarily, but that person could make to your organization if they're connected to your cause. So one of the stats that you'll hear me talk about quite often is that 85% of volunteers will donate to the charity who they volunteer with. Makes a lot of sense, right? These are people that are on a day-to-day basis, they're connected to the cause, they're seeing newsletters, they're seeing the impact of the charity and the work that's being done, and they've had first-hand experience of working with shifts or working with virtual events to be able to see the impact and the actual cause that the charity is supporting. Therefore, they are most likely to donate to that charity. There's lots of different ways that people can contribute. And once you have some volunteers connected to your cause and in the database, they could be connected maybe for years or decades to come. And during that life cycle, there might be times when Maybe they're a student and they have a bit of time to spare and they're able to volunteer regularly with you at the moment. Then there might be other times in their life where maybe they have family, maybe they have to move away for a period, maybe they have to go into full-time employment, and that affects the amount of time that they have to volunteer. But they could still stay connected to the cause. They could still understand what the organization are doing. And there was a great report that was released towards the start of this year in the UK, which was the UK Giving Report. And that talked about how 75% of people in the UK had completed a charitable act in the past 12 months. So that would be a mix of potentially volunteering, but it could also be donating goods. So maybe taking clothes to a charity store, for example, donating money. So actually just donating money through a monthly subscription or just paying to someone's cause. Sponsoring somebody, some of the events, sponsoring fundraising a marathon, collecting donations through the streets, friends, and donating. It could be a mix of all that channel things, and at different stage in your life cycle. So actually going out, contributing, doing charity in different ways. And that to me is when this really starts to blow my mind, in the sense of, if you think about what is the impact of having 4x the number of active volunteers, well, actually think about when you're understanding the lifetime value of a volunteer. If you are converting 4 times more volunteers every single year, and you extrapolate that over a 5-year, 10-year, 20, 30-year period, where you've got more and more people connected in a database to your cause, they could be over time donating in many, many different ways. And that can have an absolutely huge impact on the long-term vision of the organization and essentially the mission that you have and the people that you support. A good example of this, another customer story, and there's a QR code on screen where you can download a video to watch this interview, from Lorna, who's brilliant at Child Bereavement UK. So Lorna was working in Child Bereavement UK in the fundraising partnership and engagement manager. A lot of what she did was supporting some of the festivals that Child Bereavement UK go to. So they're raising awareness of the work that they're doing, and they are getting more donors and more people sign up to support the cause through getting out onto the streets and getting out to these events and raising awareness of their work. Lorna, when we started to go live with Rosterfy, she quickly realized that actually it could be a lot more than just that. So she noticed that the organization was quite siloed in the way that it worked. You had a fundraising team that had fundraisers. You had a donors team that went to chase up and engage with and liaise with their donors. You had volunteers supporting festival events. You had different volunteers who were supporting some of the bereaved families. And they were all sort of siloed. So everyone had their own way of working, their own database. Volunteers were in different pockets and sat in different databases potentially. So what she saw was the ability to actually put all of that into one system and find a consistent way of working across the organization. So that means that volunteers might have the ability to fundraise and donate, and it might mean that donors have the ability to come along to a volunteer event and donate some of their time. So that cross-pollination of those different silos that have all been brought together under one database and one consistent approach for the organization. What that means for the end user is they have a really consistent journey with Child Bereavement UK. Child Bereavement UK are talking in the same way. They're using the same phrases. They're not hearing one thing from the fundraising team and a different thing from the volunteering team. It's actually one organization talking across organization with a really clear and consistent message and finding ways to get people with more touch points, more engagement, and more connected to their cause. And they actually found that they went from the low 70s. So in their survey, they did a survey on how would you recommend our volunteering program? Sorry, the question was actually, would you recommend our volunteering program to one of your friends? Previously, they were around about the low 70% mark. Now, after implementing Rosterfy, they're up around 94, 95%, which is a huge, significant jump. And what's really changed is that organization are all working in the same way. There's a consistent look and feel. Everyone's working in the same direction. And for the volunteers, for the donors, for the end users, they're able to engage with the organization in different ways, but through a consistent process without having to tell their story again to 3 or 4 different people to get there. So summary of today's webinar. So I've talked about how do we ensure that we get more volunteers, but not just more volunteers, more of the right kind of volunteers, more of the people that we want to engage by tailoring the messaging to the demographics that we want to engage with. Obviously, when we're signing up volunteers, and I didn't talk about this too much, but there's an investment when it comes to attracting volunteers. So there are adverts that go out, there are postings that are done, there are websites that are created, systems that are used, teams that are sending out to events or to university fairs to engage with volunteers, there is a lot of effort and cost that goes into actually that recruitment of volunteers. So how do we get the best out of that? And able to get more signups from those activities, understand which of those activities and sources are the most beneficial, by just understanding where volunteers are coming from, and then giving them that nice experience to get more of them through the funnel. Unlock the fundraising potential through cross-selling. So as I said, with the Lorna example and child bereavement, having a nice consistent way of the organization working can help you to unlock that lifetime value of a volunteer, where they can contribute in many different ways with the same charity for many years to come. And this in turn will then avoid having to maybe use paid staff or raise more funds for your cause, but actually just get more out of the existing pool that you're currently using. It might mitigates the downward trend that we're seeing with volunteering. I hope that's been useful. It's a lot of me talking, so would love to hear from you. If you'd like to have a chat, even if it's just a talk through some of the ideas that I've shared and compare those with how your program's currently running, please do get in touch via our Rosterfy website. You can also contact me directly. My name is Sam Bennett, so it's sam.bennett@rosterfy.com. We also have another white paper on screen, which is all about volunteer recruitment, and it's a really good read, so I'd recommend you give that a download and have a read through that. Hopefully hear from you soon, and thank you very much for watching.